philosophies, including Thomas Aquinas' theory of natural law, elevate human reason to a place of prominence in the calculation of moral norms and duties. But only one tradition, rooted in the philosophy of the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant, makes the argument that the requirements of morality are to be found in pure reason. Of course, in this lecture, I'm only able to provide the briefest of sketches of Kant's moral philosophy, and I plan to do so slowly and methodically. By the end, I hope that the differences between Kant's enormously influential thought and the Thomistic worldview will be made clear. Kant's well-known book, The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, contains the most straightforward and concise statement of Kant's moral philosophy. And in that book, he argues against the entire tradition of natural law, that the principles of morality cannot be derived from human nature, as Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas say they must. This central claim of Kant's argument is taken to be a basic logical insight which, if true, would reveal the folly of all natural law theory as well. In many ways, every moral philosophy prior to Kant himself. What exactly is the problem with Thomistic natural law? Well, as Kant would argue, reflecting on human nature tells us how human beings behave, but it reveals nothing as to how human beings ought to behave, in the moral sense of the term ought. We must qualify with the words "in the moral sense," because Kant readily admits that reflecting on human nature can reveal other kinds of oughts, such as, if you want to build muscle, you ought to consume lots of protein, or if you want to raise children well, you ought to give them both love and discipline. What is distinctive about these kinds of oughts, or imperatives, says Kant, is that they have no moral content. A moral imperative is not tied down by some further goal that we desire, such as the desire to build muscle or to raise good children. Moral imperatives are grounded, rather, solely by the rational recognition that a certain action is the right thing to do. If I'm choosing to tell the truth from a moral imperative, therefore, I cannot be motivated by a desire to avoid the reputation of being a liar and the inconveniences that would come with such a reputation. I cannot even be motivated by the belief that truth-telling will make me a generally happier person. I can only be motivated by the recognition that lying is morally wrong, and so I ought not do it. As we've seen in previous lectures, Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas both teach that morality is not an end in itself. It is rather the choices one must make in order to live a genuinely happy and fulfilling life. But Kant rejects this tradition with great vehemence, and interestingly, he does so by an appeal to human reason. In fact, Kant argues that if human beings were meant for happiness, nature would have been ill-advised to make us the rational beings we are, since happiness, he thinks, can just as easily be pursued and achieved by non-rational creatures. Whether we hedonistically define happiness as maximizing bodily pleasures or the contemplation of the one true God, pursuing happiness remains devoid of any moral worth, according to Kant. Why should we receive any moral credit, Kant would ask, for simply pursuing what we naturally desire anyway? Do not irrational animals do the same, albeit with different desires? Rather than pursuing happiness, however we may happen to define happiness, what actually deserves moral esteem, according to Kant, is the fulfillment of our moral duty. More to the point, even if fulfilling our duty happens to make us happy, we only deserve moral credit for fulfilling our duty when we do so for the sake of duty. This is why Kant famously argues that the person who does his duty, because doing so makes him supremely happy, deserves far less credit, if he deserves any credit, than the one who does his duty despite the tremendous inclination not to do so. And so, Kant's morality is a morality of pure reason, because reason is prevented from consulting any data from human experience or human nature in order to derive its principles. These are, as it were, the very things from which reason has been purified. And this new purified reason is what leads to Kant's now famous categorical imperative, which undergirds all moral norms and is based solely on, quote, the universal conformity to law as such. I should never act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim should become a universal law. So, in Kant's world, I know it's morally wrong to lie in order to escape from a difficult situation, because I cannot rationally will a world in which everybody lied in such cases. If everybody lied to escape difficult situations, then lying for this reason would become wholly ineffective. I know furthermore that I have a moral duty to help others when I'm able, because I myself cannot will to live in a world in which no one helped others. Again, Kant's argument is not the utilitarian one, according to which we need to do our part in helping bring about a more desirable world. Our motive in helping others cannot be the fulfillment of any desires whatsoever. The fact that we wouldn't desire a world in which no one helped others is merely the test which reveals that helping others is part of our moral duty. And that fact alone is what motivates the truly moral person. The moral law, in Kant's view, does not come from human nature any more than it comes from God. It is a law discovered by reason and something that all rational beings, including God, are fully able to impose on themselves. Sometimes following the moral law will be advantageous, and sometimes it won't. Sometimes being a moral person will make one happy, and sometimes it will not. But all considerations of advantage and happiness, Kant insists, are just irrelevant in determining what the moral law is and why we should obey it. Kant's moral philosophy is extremely austere and may even rightly be admired in some respects. As Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas would readily admit, simply observing how humans behave most of the time is no indication of how they ought to behave. Whether 10% or 80% of married men commit adultery is irrelevant as to the moral wrongness of adultery. How many civilizations of the past and present have practiced cannibalism is likewise irrelevant as to the morality of eating other human beings. And the mere fact that a man claims burning people alive makes him happy is no indication that he's acting in a morally good manner. But Kant's claim that morality cannot be derived in any way from human nature or human happiness goes too far. There are many avenues from which to criticize Kant's moral philosophy. One very odd aspect of his teaching, for instance, has to do with his analysis of human freedom. As he rightly acknowledges, there can simply be no such thing as morality unless human beings have free will. And yet he also argues emphatically that we have no way of knowing whether we have free will or not. For all we know, philosophically, all our actions are determined by physical impulses. And so Kant's moral teaching, for all of its complexity, rigor, and subtlety, makes no claim that there even is such a thing as morality at all. The most Kant can say for his own thought is that it gives us what morality would be on the assumption that free will is real. I don't mention this exactly as a refutation of Kant's argument. It doesn't mean his teaching is incoherent or even necessarily false. It just means that someone claiming to be fully committed to the Kantian understanding of morality must also admit, by Kant's own admission, that the very thing they're committed to may amount to nothing at all. From the perspective of St. Thomas Aquinas, though, the most troubling thing about Kant's morality of pure reason is his understanding of moral reasoning itself. If the claim that morality is based on reason has any meaning at all, there must be some meaningful way to distinguish between right reason and wrong reason. On the Thomistic view outlined in this series of lectures so far, right moral reasoning is right because it conforms with human nature and the eternal law written on the human heart. And wrong reason is wrong because it does not so conform. Otherwise stated, there are certain kinds of actions and habits of character that facilitate a human being flourishing as a human being, and there are certain actions and habits that do not so facilitate. On St. Thomas's natural law theory, therefore, reason is only able to distinguish the morally good from the morally bad by observing human nature. And human nature, in turn, is precisely the standard against which moral reasoning may be judged as right or wrong. On Kant's view, however, the only thing reason is permitted to consult is itself. But how, we must ask, does a person whose moral reasoning leads to immoral actions necessarily reason, on Kant's view, incorrectly? Let's take Kant's own example of someone that makes a promise without the intention of keeping it. Yes, it's true that such a person intends to hold himself to a standard below which he hopes others will be held. Yes, it's true that if everyone acted this way, the person in question would not be able to make his lying promise to any advantage for himself. This means that he is both selfish and untrustworthy. But how exactly, on Kant's view, is he wrong? Wherein lies his error? All that we can really say is that he makes an exception for himself at the expense of others. One might argue that his actions imply a false belief on his part, namely the belief that he possesses a greater worth or dignity than the others he hopes will tell the truth. But in fact, his actions need not imply any such thing. When accused of holding a false belief, he may just respond, "I don't actually think that I'm worth more than anyone else. My actions are simply and exclusively oriented to maximizing my own advantage. And in performing them, I don't take anyone's inherent worth, including my own, into account at all." Now, such a brazen admission of selfishness would be shocking and repulsive to all decent people. But it's difficult to see how, on Kant's view, such a person's moral reasoning has gone astray if the only thing against which we can judge reason is reason itself. Akin, for example, to the errors in reasoning we observe in the commission of logical fallacies, for example. Aristotle and Aquinas, of course, citing human nature and, in Aquinas' case, natural law, would appeal to the fact that this man is a worse person for thinking and acting in the way that he does, and that in so doing he stifles his own human nature, which is designed to flourish by telling the truth and acting in the interests of others, in addition to oneself. But of course, Kant can make no such appeal. The deeper problem here is that Kant is attempting to overturn a tradition of moral philosophy, beginning with Plato, that recognizes the central importance of the question, why be moral? The greatest philosophers prior to Kant were well aware that this is hardly an irrelevant question. Plato himself, in his Republic, seemed well aware that one can only defend justice adequately by showing that living justly is better, not simply in general or for the advantage of others, but for the just person himself. Far from pandering to the selfishness of the morally bad, this more ancient approach to morality is based on the recognition that all explanations of morality necessarily have the burden of explaining why someone should act morally in the first place. It's no good to devise a theory that responds, well, that's just what morality requires. If that's the best answer one can muster, the truly rational agent, pursuing his own happiness as the ultimate end, will be fully entitled to conclude, well then, to hell with morality. As we've already seen, Thomistic natural law provides a picture of morality that gives us a reason to be moral beyond the desire to conform to moral rules for their own sake. That teaching, moreover, attempts to show us that the one who lives morally is better, happier, more fulfilled, and lives a more fully human life than the one who lives immorally. Kant's moral teaching, unfortunately, shows no such thing.